there's nothing politically neutral about language access or use or pedagogy, just like there's no sort of neutral classroom. And so classrooms are really such an incredible meeting space in terms of what, brings people into the classroom and from where. And the idea that there's one ideal model of education and that is a sort of one-to-one unilateral relationship is, at this point, really outdated and harmful.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Dr. Julian Currents joins us to discuss universal design for learning and how our growing understanding of neurodivergence and chronic illness can help create a classroom space that is more beneficial to all.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Today, we are speaking with Julian Currents, a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the writing program at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
Their research and teaching focus on the evolving relationship between commodities, consumption, and empire, and their critical work examines these shifting emotional landscapes through Caribbean literature, speculative fictions, eco-criticism, and post-colonial critique.
Julian is also a former classmate of mine from the English program at Ithaca College, and they will share some current research on universal design and rethinking what it means to make the classroom an accessible space.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Julian.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, Julian, it's great to have you here. Before we dive into your current work, we'd like to start by asking you about your background and path with languages. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I want to start by saying that it would be most honest, despite everything I'm about to say, to describe myself as a monolingual English speaker. On my good days. That being said, I do love language, and I've always been interested by and in it. So I grew up in a pretty multilingual environment. I grew up in the 90s in South Florida, the Florida Keys specifically. So I grew up in a space where I was hearing a lot of different languages, and also hearing obviously what, as an 8-year-old, we would not have been referring to this at the time, but they wouldn't have been sort of prestige dialects of those languages. So at the time, even as a kid, to an extent, I was aware that there were like good versions of language and bad versions of language, and there were assumptions to be made about the speakers of each, right? Then in school, right, I went to public school, so the coverage was kind of spotty. We were offered a couple years of Spanish in elementary school, no second language in middle school, and then an option of French or Spanish in high school. I took French, went to college and switched over and took 4 years of Italian and double majored in that. Nice. During those years, I actually also did a sort of archival internship at Cornell in the Willard J. Fisk archive. Nice. Where all the materials I was working with were in Icelandic. So I was learning sort of chunks of vocab for that. And then sort of in my graduate work, I was a TA for a couple of semesters for linguistics courses, which I really enjoyed. And these days, I mostly think about languages less in sort of like a studying practicum kind of way and more in like a historical and cultural analysis framework. So I'm interested in a lot of the sort of historical journeys of languages, what they suggest about movements of people. I'm really sort of invested in a lot of like heritage speaking content creators. And I'm really fascinated by, I feel like this new generation is really interested in sort of like reclaiming endangered languages, which is really incredible to see. And so, yeah, that would be sort of my broad scale relationship to language.
Nice. So one project that you are currently working on is an article about universal design and disability access in the college classroom. Can you start by giving us and our listeners a broad overview of what that looks like?
Absolutely. So universal design as a concept itself comes out of architecture and sort of access disability lenses. And it's really just the idea that you design a building from the outset, from its design, with the idea of including access for as many people as possible, regardless of ability or age. And the idea is that if you design a building with access in mind from the outset, in the long term, it will be more efficient, more useful as a building, more architecturally beautiful, and ultimately less expensive because you won't be sort of retrofitting it with
Right.
access devices, right? So universal design for learning really just echoes those ideas, but in the classroom setting. So it's the idea, these ideas are coming out of research that's being done in Harvard in the 80s, and then sort of coming into the classroom post ADA being passed. To be very clear, these are sort of ideas that disability advocates had been advocating for quite some time, but in terms of sort of formal pedagogical study, we're sort of talking about the 80s into the 90s. And so UDL, which is sort of the abbreviation for it, is based on research from a variety of fields, sort of composited, and it proposes alternative or flexible learning environments that, again, sort of begin with the presumption that students will be presenting in a variety of ways. And this doesn't necessarily just mean in terms of ability or disability, but a variety of capacity, right, is the term that I use in my class. So along these lines, the intention behind UDL is to increase access to learning across the board by reducing barriers that at this point sort of have seeped into a lot of educational systems, so physical barriers, intellectual, organizational barriers, et cetera. Specifically, when we're talking about UDL in terms of sort of practical application, we're talking about instructional goals, we're talking about methods and materials and assessments. So what are we going to learn, how and with what, and then how will we assess that we have learned the thing? And in a classroom, this can be sort of practiced in a variety of ways, right? So engaging students by presenting information in a variety of modes instead of sort of a singular lecture with no visual aids. Giving students multiple and various ways to show that they've absorbed the material and sort of not just this standardized testing idea. And transparency. So transparency with lesson plans, with assignments, using, plain language, giving explicit instructions, and being very explicit with expectations that you're setting in the classroom.
Right.
This is a bit of a departure from your usual scholarly work. What drew you into this area of study? And are there connections between this and your past writing, or does it feel like uncharted territory?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of what drew me into this study, or this sort of field, it's a sort of a three-pronged answer. There are sort of many factors, but the primary factors are going to be teaching first-year writing at a school with a significant international student population and a lot of students that are English language learners, most of whom are multilingual. So that, and also my sixth-year fellowship, which was at the Emory Writing Center specifically, and I'll get into that in a minute. The second prong will be sort of reading a lot of scholarship about COVID-19 and about long COVID, especially in pediatric medicine. And the third prong is going to be partially coming into a clearer understanding of my own disabilities and how those presented in a classroom when I was a student, because I was a student for a very long time, and also how those present as an instructor. So to unpack those a little bit, right, I started teaching first-year writing courses in 2018 as a PhD student, so it's been, multiple years. We had pedagogical training as graduate students, and in that way I've been thinking about these kinds of materials for a long time in terms of access, especially in writing, which is it's an intimidating field even for professionals who practice it daily. Emory has a lot of international students, and so during my fellowship year, we spent a lot of time discussing how to sort of design pedagogy with English language learners in mind. And then and this was also sort of during the early years of the pandemic, right? So I was also increasingly aware of how to make educational materials more accessible in a remote setting. We were teaching online classes. So we were taking pedagogy courses in designing courses that were accessible online exclusively. Right. And I started to think a lot more about just access in the classroom and how to make educational materials as accessible to a diverse student body as possible. In terms of the pandemic, right, I think you could ask anyone who was teaching pre and post, and they'll tell you that there's just a significant shift in how students are presenting in class, how they're capable of presenting in class. With each new incoming first-year cohort, we have students whose education was interrupted earlier and earlier. And in terms of scholarship, I mean, COVID-19, I read recently, is the most researched health condition in any 4 years of recorded human history. Wow. And we're talking upwards of like well over 20,000 published scholarly articles. Wow. And so we have this bounty of knowledge that is really telling us that the way that COVID lingers in the body impacts cognitive function. I know I've experienced that myself, and there's, now this really incredible, dense body of scholarship that suggests the same. So if we are, in any way interested in accommodating incoming classes of students, we need to be more cognizant of how we're designing our classes for them. Historically, I think we see that disability is either met punitively or with accommodation. And so those are kind of the only two options. But yeah, I mean, to the third point, in the past 5 to 10 years, we've also seen this really interesting expansion in medical understandings of neurodiversity, specifically autism and ADHD. So we're seeing higher rates of diagnosis, sort of higher engagements with education intervention programs, and an increase in supportive systems and accommodations. We're also seeing, especially since the pandemic, but also in the past few years, an increase in students requesting accommodations at the university level, which is fantastic. And I'm very excited about this. I think a lot about, I think if you teach, it's very common to think about the best teachers that you had and the not best teachers that you had. And you pick the things that worked and you sort of leave some things behind. And I mean, when we were in undergrad, it was this sort of interesting bridge time between completely sort of analog and completely digital in terms of education access. I mean, I was still submitting term papers by sliding them under the doors of professors printed on paper. And that wasn't even that long ago, right? So now we have, very interactive digital platforms in terms of Canvas and Blackboard. And the access is there, especially if we're talking about sort of these very well-funded private universities with smart classrooms and projection services and all these ways to make education more accessible. And at this point, like, it feels like there's very little excuse to not, right? I mean, like, if I was in college when there were still blackboards with chalk being used, I am very, aware that even the best teachers, they're not going to present, bring in visual materials every single day to class, but we have that ability now to, in fairly low amounts of labor, to sort of put these materials together and make them accessible. To your second question, though, sort of, are there connections between this and my past writing? Does it feel like uncharted territory? It does feel like uncharted territory in the specific sense that my scholarship before has only ever been in literary analysis, cultural analysis. And there is definitely aspects of that in this essay that I am composing, but it's in a different genre, right? I'm writing to different journals, and there are just sort of generic differences between, writing a social sciences paper where there's methods and analysis and sort of sectioning, and literary analysis, which is much more, I think, flexible to whatever it is that you're addressing. But in terms of connections, there are many connections, constant connections for me. I think, when I read these, peer-reviewed journal articles about COVID, or when I read them about autism in the classroom, or when I read them about English language learning, I am able to, when I read these, sort of understand a lot of contemporary medicine today, even in the best intentions, sometimes is based off of really violent assumptions from the 17 and 1800s that were made in medicine and then sort of built off of into now, right? Even to the extent that if we're talking about the idea that health is a choice, like a choice that you can make and not sort of a birth lottery and systemic levels of influence and violence, then we're tracing that idea. We can trace that back to sort of the 1800s and the birth of eugenics, which you can trace back to, colonial racist pseudosciences, not even the correct word, but of like phrenology.
Right.
And these studies were all sort of developed out of the need to perpetuate increasingly violent systems. And so understanding that when I read these pedagogy journals, and when you sort of like comb through these practices, you start to see where these practices and assumptions come from, which for me makes them much easier to unpack and sort of push to the side. But yeah, that's sort of how I see the transition.
Great.
That's fascinating. What a broad variety of things that you work in. It's really awesome.
Thank
So
you.
for our podcast, our audience consists largely of educators in the field of language and culture. Are there specific ways you see your research or research around UDL impacting language pedagogy specifically?
Yeah. And I want to be very clear, too, that I'm not in any way trying to sort of fold in the lived experiences of English language learners with autistic folks, with people living with long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, language access in the classroom, my hope is that a lot of these ideas are applicable to all classrooms and to all fields, right? So what I'm advocating for isn't really new. There's been pedagogy written about access and UDL and phenomenons like ungrading for years and years now. What I'm sort of trying to identify is that there are new and increasingly visible reasons to embrace these ideas. There's nothing politically neutral about language access or use or pedagogy, just like there's no sort of neutral classroom. The way that we teach is just as worthy of critique as the content that we're teaching. And so classrooms are really such an incredible meeting space in terms of what brings people into the classroom and from where, and the idea that there's one ideal model of education and that is a sort of one-to-one unilateral relationship is at this point really outdated and harmful.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of language access, I think about sort of, will it be pedagogically more effective to stand behind a podium for an hour and lecture, and then sort of assess student retention with a single high-stakes timed multiple-choice exam, when, lecturing can be a really difficult way to intake information, especially if the audience is in the process of learning the language the lecture is being given in, or in terms of access, if the audience has members with auditory processing disorders like I do, or dyslexia like I also do, which can present challenges to delineating orally between certain spoken consonant sounds, right? So would it be more effective in terms of pedagogy to provide visual materials, to provide multiple levels of access, and then to design multiple methods of assessment? I think ultimately you'll get just a better result and a more well-rounded classroom. And this can be sort of applied to pedagogy broadly.
Sure.
Jumping off from that, what are some takeaways that educators can implement? Are there actionable items that you can think of that they can bring to their classrooms today?
Yeah. So I want to also begin by saying that a lot of my suggestions are going to be sort of ultimately reflections of systemic changes in thinking. So moving away from punitive and centralized models of learning, especially in higher education. There really is this sort of broad spectrum devaluing of the teaching portion of being a professor, where your publications are sort of meant to be your primary focus. And so redesigning classes from their foundations can feel very labor intensive, especially at first. And so I understand why instructors would be sort of reticent to start implementing these changes. But I do also think that there are sort of stepping stones towards education equity that can be made on smaller scales if you're sort of just starting out and thinking about these kinds of things. One of the sort of central tenets of my class is that I moved away from grading attendance. So, for example, in my classes, this is now my third year doing this, actually maybe my fourth year. Possibly my fourth year doing this. I don't attach a grade to the students' physical attendance of individual classes. I explain early on, and I repeat this multiple times, that they will benefit from being in the classroom. The classes that I teach now are not designed to be hybrid classes or designed to be fully remote classes, so truly the bulk of instruction does happen in the classroom. And it is also sort of along those lines, their responsibility to keep up with class materials and lecture slides that I do post. But to me, the question of grading attendance ultimately really ends up being, what's the pedagogical value in grading a person's capacity to sit still in a brightly lit room and perform an illusion of focus for an hour and 15 minutes, especially an 18-year-old?
Yeah.
And along those lines, right, like what is the value, the pedagogical value in grading a person's body for being too ill to come to class, right? What is being learned in that assessment? If attendance is an assessment, what is being assessed? So instead, what I do is I have a course engagement grade that is a hybrid grade composed of numerous potential small stakes assignments that reflect engagement with the course materials, much in the same way, hopefully, that sort of being in a classroom would reflect those same engagements. Yep. And so students do have, it's really up to them. And what the most beautiful thing is that ultimately I find that especially first-year students want to be in class. They want to be in class. They want to come to class. Attendance is across the board really strong in my courses. And when students come to class, they want to be there. They're making the choice on purpose to be there because the threat isn't losing grade point value in the class. The threat is maybe you're not as engaged with the material that day as you could have been, which is a much lower stakes threat in terms of punitive education standards. But yeah, I mean, if these questions are not at the forefront of your thinking, it's really okay. But understanding that evaluating a student's engagement in a classroom can come in many forms allows students to participate more authentically when they are in class, because when they are there, they will be sort of not less distracted from trying to absorb the lesson by confronting barriers to that absorption. I do a couple other things in terms of syllabus changes. Instead of having sort of harsh deadlines for assignments, I don't actually grade down for assignments being late. I do sort of reinforce, again, that there's a structure to the semester and that sort of following that schedule will be in their best interest in terms of time management. And ultimately, I find that I'm fielding fewer emails because there were fewer students panicked about approaching deadlines and asking for, and I mean, at Emory is an R1 institution. Most of these students have been in high pressure educational situations for a long time. And often they're asking me for 2-hour extensions, one day extensions. And instead of doing that, right, I give them 4 days. I say, it would be in your best interest to submit the assignment between this date and this date. And if you do so, I can promise you prompt and thorough feedback. If it's outside of that window, I might not be able to get back to you. Your grade might be delayed because that's sort of how it's reflected in my own scheduling. And overwhelmingly, I find that I have almost no panicked emails about submission deadlines. Most students submit during the window. There's no IBR involved in this, so these are just sort of self-reporting numbers, but upwards of 80% of the students submit during the window, and the rest submit in the next couple days, which by the time I sit down to grade the assignments, probably 1 or 2 are missing. And those students usually have a lot of other things going on. And so I find that being able to sort of accommodate them allows them to accommodate me as well. And there's just a more honest and transparent relationship in terms of academic performance on both sides.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So now that you've addressed things instructors can do individually, what kind of larger, more systemic changes would you like to see from your research and the work of others in the field?
Yeah, excellent question. So in terms of the research that I'm doing and have done, historically it's been pretty interdisciplinary. I really am interested in sort of connections across fields. And so in composing this essay, sort of taking not just from pedagogy, but from, medical journals, and sort of combining a lot of these praxes. Ultimately, I hope generally that education becomes more interdisciplinary. There are sort of endless, infinite studies that prove that sort of, taking humanities classes makes you a better doctor, makes you a better lawyer, makes you a better fill in the blank. And likewise, we're seeing a really interesting increase in sort of courses that take humanities through digital lenses, assessing sort of digital rhetorics. And so we're in sort of the prime time, technologically speaking, to be able to do all of this interdisciplinary work without much resistance in terms of accessing the materials to do it. And as we progress through time, but as we sort of live further into this pandemic, right? We're really looking at a changing population, and in terms of accrued change over time, we can really look at it in terms of punitive responses or accommodating responses, right? Do we want to exclude or do we want to include? Do we want to make sure that only the wealthiest can access these concepts, or that broad scale people are able to engage with them? So my hope really is just that an increased understanding at the university level can set educational standards for best practice in classrooms, right? Especially if we're talking about scholarship and pedagogy scholarship. Often we do sort of have to wait for university level scholarship to respond to these, for them to be taken up by a more significant population in terms of education.
Julian, this has been great to talk about all of this with you. We appreciate you being here. Before we sign off, we would like to ask you to share a word in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn, that feels good to say. What is that word?
So I love this question so much, and I want to cheat. I brought 2. I brought 2
You're not the first, and you won't be the last.
I felt very responsible capping it at 2, so this is my pitch. In terms, sort of circling back to the first question you asked me in terms of my relationship to language, I did not mention this, but I did my master's degree at Trinity College Dublin, and I lived in Ireland for a year. And at the time, they were offering free Irish language lessons for both semesters for sort of any students. And so I did take both semesters. Nice. It is an incredibly difficult language to learn, but I do teach a lot about sort of Irish rhetorics. And so my 2 words, one is actually an English word, but from an Irish context. So boycott is the word. And the word boycott actually was a last name. So it comes from Captain Charles Boycott. He was a land agent, so like a rent collector, for an absentee landlord in County Mayo during active colonization of Ireland by the British Empire. So in the 1880s, during the Land War, it was really common for tenant farmers to be evicted from their lands if their crop harvest was poor. and Charles Boycott attempted to evict several tenants from his employer's land. However, Charles Parnell, who was the president of the Irish National Land League, which was an organization that organized Irish tenant farmers against their colonial landlords, encouraged residents to socially ostracize anyone who took up tenancy in a farm where the previous farmer had been evicted. And it was incredibly effective. And that is where we actually get the word boycott from.
Wow.
Fascinating.
I did not know
Yes.
that.
I had no idea.
Nope.
I'm the sort of historical resistance in Ireland is one of my favorite things to teach. And sort of in that vein, I'm not sure if this is all right, but I want to plug a movie I saw recently.
Yeah.
I recently watched the Irish film Kneecap. Have either of you heard of it?
No.
Ooh, it's lovely. So it's sort of a fictionalized origin story of a contemporary rap group out of West Belfast in Northern Ireland. So they exist now. Two of their members are sort of in their mid-20s, so they're sort of post-Good Friday Agreement Irish. And one of the members is in their mid-30s. And they rap exclusively or mostly predominantly in the Irish language, which is a very old language, obviously. And so in order to update it, they do a lot of translation work and they talk a lot about sort of how to address contemporary issues, concepts with a very old language. And sort of part of their origin story in the film involves one of their members spray painting the word Cairta on a bus, which is the Irish word for rights, like civil rights. And he gets arrested and then refuses to speak English at the police station because that's his right. His right is to speak Irish if he wants. And so this is sort of the film itself is absolutely delightful, and it really does talk a lot about sort of what it looks like to live in a partitioned state, right? Sort of Northern Ireland, especially West Belfast, and the city of Belfast is heavily segregated along sectarian lines, along class lines, really. So it's a really lovely film. It's really funny. It's really exciting, and it tells a really interesting story about sort of, I mean, again, sort of to discuss, right, younger heritage language speakers, and sort of bringing back or reclaiming endangered languages.
Interesting.
So yeah.
Well, Sam, I guess
Those are
we
my
both
words.
know what movie to watch.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like something I'll be adding to my list.
Well, as Sam mentioned, this was wonderful, so fascinating. Thank you for the important work that you do. And thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Julian.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute delight.
Next week, we will introduce our new LRC team member, Ashley Griffith.
Tune in to hear more about Ashley, her role as engagement and outreach coordinator, and our plans for supporting language students and language learning.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.